The story starts from this man Marcus Webb, a power grid technician who thought the most dangerous thing about his job was climbing frozen towers in the dead of winter, but what he didn't know was that some places hold onto darkness in ways that defy every natural law, and what waits in that darkness doesn't just watch, it mirrors, it learns, it replaces. And on one freezing January night, Marcus would discover that his own shadow had been studying him, learning his movements, memorizing his gestures, waiting for the perfect moment to show him that he was never truly alone in that station. Welcome to the real conflict zone. Marcus Webb had been working for Northern Power Solutions for 7 years, and in that time he had seen his share of strange malfunctions, flickering lights that spelled out patterns, blown fuses that shouldn't have blown, backup generators that started themselves in the middle of the night, but he always found an explanation: a loose wire, a faulty circuit, a rodent chewing through insulation, because Marcus was a man who believed in what he could touch, what he could measure, what he could fix with his hands and a toolbox. But Station 17 was different from the moment he arrived. The facility sat at the edge of the Greystone Valley, 40 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a single winding road that turned to mud when it rained and ice when it snowed. It was a squat concrete building surrounded by high-voltage towers that hummed with electricity day and night, casting long shadows across the frozen ground. The station had been built in the 1960s, back when the government was expanding the power grid into rural areas, and it had the look of something designed for function, not comfort: bare walls, narrow hallways, fluorescent lights that buzzed like trapped insects. Marcus pulled his truck into the gravel lot just after sunset. The sky above was the color of old bruises, purple and gray and swollen with the promise of snow. He killed the engine and sat for a moment staring at the building through the windshield. The lights inside were on, but they had a strange quality to them, flickering just slightly, not enough to be obvious, but enough to make him uneasy. He had been to Station 17 twice before, once 3 years ago for a routine inspection and once 18 months ago to replace a faulty transformer, and both times he had felt the same unease, the same sense that something about the place was fundamentally wrong, but he had pushed those feelings aside because feelings didn't pay the bills, and Northern Power Solutions paid well, especially for remote assignments that required technicians to work alone. Marcus shook his head, grabbed his gear bag from the passenger seat, and stepped out into the cold. The wind hit him immediately, cutting through his jacket and making his eyes water. He hurried to the entrance, punched in the access code, and pushed through the heavy steel door. Inside, the air was stale and slightly too warm, the kind of heat that comes from old radiators that can't be properly regulated. The entrance hallway was narrow, with scuffed linoleum floors and walls painted in institutional beige. A bulletin board hung near the door covered in outdated safety notices, and a faded map of the power grid. Marcus had been here twice before, both times for routine maintenance, and both times he had been eager to leave. There was something about the place that felt wrong. Not haunted exactly, but empty in a way that suggested it shouldn't be. He walked down the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the silence, and noticed something he hadn't seen on his previous visits: photographs on the wall, old black and white images in cheap frames showing the station during its construction in the 60s. Men in hard hats standing beside equipment, women in period dresses cutting ribbons at what must have been the opening ceremony, and in every single photograph Marcus noticed the shadows were wrong, too dark, too defined, as if they had been added in post-production or painted onto the prints. He stopped in front of one photograph that showed 3 men standing in front of the main entrance, their faces smiling and proud, but their shadows stretched behind them at impossible angles given the position of the sun in the sky, and in one of the shadows Marcus could swear he saw details that shouldn't be there: the suggestion of a face, the outline of hands raised as if waving. He tore his gaze away and continued down the hallway, telling himself it was just old photography techniques, just the limitations of cameras from 60 years ago, just his imagination playing tricks on him because he was tired and the lighting in the building was poor. The control room was at the end of the main hallway, a cramped space filled with monitoring equipment, circuit breaker panels, and a desk buried under technical manuals and coffee-stained logbooks. Marcus set his gear down and checked the main console. The readouts showed normal operations. The story starts from this man Marcus Webb, a power grid technician who thought the most dangerous thing about his job was climbing frozen towers in the dead of winter, but what he didn't know was that some places hold onto darkness in ways that defy every natural law, and what waits in that darkness doesn't just watch, it mirrors, it learns, it replaces. And on one freezing January night Marcus would discover that his own shadow had been studying him, learning his movements, memorizing his gestures, waiting for the perfect moment to show him that he was never truly alone in that station. Welcome to the real conflict zone. Marcus Webb had been working for Northern Power Solutions for 7 years, and in that time he had seen his share of strange malfunctions, flickering lights that spelled out patterns, blown fuses that shouldn't have blown, backup generators that started themselves in the middle of the night, But he always found an explanation: a loose wire, a faulty circuit, a rodent chewing through insulation, because Marcus was a man who believed in what he could touch, what he could measure, what he could fix with his hands and a toolbox. But Station 17 was different from the moment he arrived. The facility sat at the edge of the Greystone Valley, 40 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a single winding road that turned to mud when it rained and ice when it snowed. It was a squat concrete building surrounded by high-voltage towers that hummed with electricity day and night, casting long shadows across the frozen ground. The station had been built in the 1960s, back when the government was expanding the power grid into rural areas, and it had the look of something designed for function, not comfort. Bare walls, narrow hallways, fluorescent lights that buzzed like trapped insects. Marcus pulled his truck into the gravel lot just after sunset. The sky above was the color of old bruises, purple and gray and swollen with the promise of snow. He killed the engine and sat for a moment staring at the building through the windshield. The lights inside were on, but they had a strange quality to them, flickering just slightly, not enough to be obvious but enough to make him uneasy. He had been to Station 17 twice before, once 3 years ago for a routine inspection and once 18 months ago to replace a faulty transformer, and both times he had felt the same unease, the same sense that something about the place was fundamentally wrong, but he had pushed those feelings aside because feelings didn't pay the bills, and Northern Power Solutions paid well, especially for remote assignments that required technicians to work alone. Marcus shook his head, grabbed his gear bag from the passenger seat, and stepped out into the cold. The wind hit him immediately, cutting through his jacket and making his eyes water. He hurried to the entrance, punched in the access code, and pushed through the heavy steel door. Inside, the air was stale and slightly too warm, the kind of heat that comes from old radiators that can't be properly regulated. The entrance hallway was narrow, with scuffed linoleum floors and walls painted in institutional beige. A bulletin board hung near the door covered in outdated safety notices, and a faded map of the power grid. Marcus had been here twice before, both times for routine maintenance, and both times he had been eager to leave. There was something about the place that felt wrong. Not haunted exactly, but empty in a way that suggested it shouldn't be. He walked down the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the silence, and noticed something he hadn't seen on his previous visits: photographs on the wall, old black and white images in cheap frames showing the station during its construction in the 60s. Men in hard hats standing beside equipment, women in period dresses cutting ribbons at what must have been the opening ceremony, and in every single photograph Marcus noticed the shadows were wrong, too dark, too defined, as if they had been added in post-production or painted onto the prints. He stopped in front of one photograph that showed 3 men standing in front of the main entrance, their faces smiling and proud, but their shadows stretched behind them at impossible angles given the position of the sun in the sky, and in one of the shadows Marcus could swear he saw details that shouldn't be there: the suggestion of a face, the outline of hands raised as if waving. He tore his gaze away and continued down the hallway, telling himself it was just old photography techniques, just the limitations of cameras from 60 years ago, just his imagination playing tricks on him because he was tired and the lighting in the building was poor. The control room was at the end of the main hallway, a cramped space filled with monitoring equipment, circuit breaker panels, and a desk buried under technical manuals and coffee-stained logbooks. Marcus set his gear down and checked the main console. The readouts showed normal operations. Voltage steady, load balanced, no alerts, but the lights overhead continued their subtle flicker. He frowned, pulled out his tablet, and logged into the diagnostic system, running a quick scan of the electrical systems. The results came back clean: no shorts, no surges, no anomalies. He ran it again just to be sure, same results. Marcus sighed and rubbed his eyes. He had been up since for that morning, driving 3 hours to another site before getting the call about Station 17. The dispatcher had said there were reports of irregular power delivery to the surrounding area, intermittent brownouts that didn't show up in the remote monitoring system. Someone needed to go check it out in person, and Marcus was the closest technician available. The dispatcher had also mentioned something else, something that stuck in Marcus's mind as he stared at the normal readouts on his tablet. She had said that the previous technician scheduled for this job had called in sick at the last minute, claiming he had a bad feeling about going to Station 17, that he had dreamed about the place the night before, and in the dream his shadow had come alive and strangled him. Marcus had laughed when he heard that, called the guy superstitious, told the dispatcher he would handle it no problem, but now sitting in the control room with the lights flickering overhead and the photographs with their wrong shadows hanging in the hallway, he wasn't laughing anymore. He decided to start with a physical inspection of the building, walking the circuit breaker rooms, checking connections, testing voltage at key distribution points. It was tedious work, but it was what he was good at: methodical, thorough, leaving no stone unturned. The first breaker room was on the lower level, down a flight of concrete stairs that echoed with each footstep. The air grew colder as he descended, and the smell of ozone and old metal grew stronger. He pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside. The room was long and narrow-lined on both sides with tall gray panels, each one housing dozens of circuit breakers that controlled power distribution to different zones of the grid. A single fluorescent light fixture hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows across the floor. Marcus flipped the light switch by the door, and the fixture buzzed to life, then immediately began to flicker. He stood there for a moment, watching the light pulse, watching the shadows on the floor expand and contract with each flicker, and that's when he first noticed it. His shadow was moving differently. Not dramatically, not obviously, but just slightly out of sync with his own movements. When he raised his hand to adjust his collar, his shadow seemed to complete the gesture a fraction of a second late. When he turned his head, his shadow's head lagged behind, as if it were copying him from memory rather than mirroring him in real time. Marcus froze, staring down at the dark outline of himself on the concrete floor. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, watching his shadow do the same, but the timing felt wrong, like watching a video with the audio slightly out of sync. He blinked, shook his head, told himself he was tired, that the flickering light was playing tricks on his eyes, that he needed to get the inspection done and get out of this place. He turned his attention to the breaker panels, pulling open the access doors and checking the connections inside. Everything looked normal: wires properly seated, no signs of corrosion or overheating, no loose components. He moved down the row of panels, checking each one in turn, and as he worked he became increasingly aware of his shadow moving across the floor beside him. It stretched long and thin in the harsh overhead light, sliding across the concrete as he walked, and every time he glanced at it, he had the unsettling feeling that it was watching him back. Marcus finished his inspection of the breaker room and headed back upstairs, his footsteps echoing in the stairwell. As he climbed back toward the main level, he emerged into the hallway and paused, listening to the building around him, the hum of electrical equipment, the rattle of air in the ventilation ducts, the tick of pipes expanding and contracting, and underneath it all a sound he couldn't quite place, a low rhythmic pulse like a heartbeat, buried deep in the walls. He checked the next section of the facility, the generator room, a large space dominated by two massive diesel generators that served as backup power in case the main grid failed. They sat silent now, their metal housings cold to the touch. Marcus performed a quick inspection, checking fuel levels, testing the starter systems, running diagnostic sequences. Everything checked out. But the lights in the generator room were flickering too, the same subtle, irregular pulse that he had noticed throughout the building, and when he looked down at his shadow on the oil-stained floor, he saw it again, that slight delay, that sense that his shadow was not quite keeping pace with his movements. He was starting to feel uneasy now, a creeping sensation at the back of his neck, like someone was standing just behind him watching him work. He turned around quickly, scanning the empty room, but there was nothing there, just the generators sitting silent in their metal cradles, just the flickering lights overhead, just his shadow stretching long across the floor. Marcus decided to return to the control room and review the system logs more carefully. There had to be an explanation for the flickering lights, some pattern in the data that would reveal the source of the problem. He climbed back upstairs, entered the control room, and sat down at the desk, pulling up the monitoring software on his tablet. The logs showed normal operation going back weeks, no errors, no warnings, no unusual events, but as he scrolled through the data, he noticed something odd. There were gaps, small ones, only a few seconds at a time, but they appeared regularly scattered throughout the logs, like someone had carefully edited out specific moments. He frowned and dug deeper, pulling up the raw data files, and that's when he found it buried in the system logs, a series of entries that had been flagged as corrupted and automatically hidden from the main interface. They were time-stamped over the past 3 months, always occurring late at night, always lasting between 5 and 15 seconds. Marcus opened one of the corrupted log entries and stared at the screen. The data was garbled nonsense, strings of characters that made no sense, but embedded within the corruption were snippets of coherent information, power draw readings that showed massive spikes, voltage fluctuations that should have triggered emergency shutdowns, load distribution patterns that defied the physical limits of the equipment. But what caught his attention most was a notation buried deep in one of the log files, a timestamp that corresponded to one of his previous visits to Station 17 18 months ago. When he had come to replace the transformer, he pulled up his own maintenance records and compared the times. They matched exactly. He had been in the building during one of these mysterious events, and he had no memory of it, no awareness that anything unusual had happened. He sat back in his chair, his heart beating faster, trying to remember that day. He had arrived in the afternoon, had spent about 3 hours replacing the transformer, had filed his report, and driven home. Nothing unusual, nothing memorable, just another routine job. But according to the logs, something had happened during those 3 hours, something significant enough to cause massive power fluctuations and corrupt the monitoring systems. Marcus stood up and paced the small control room, trying to piece together what was happening: the flickering lights, the corrupted logs, the gaps in the data, his shadow moving independently. It all pointed to something, but he couldn't quite grasp what. He needed to see the main power distribution center, the core of the facility where all the incoming power lines converged before being routed out to the surrounding grid. It was located in the basement, 2 levels below ground, in a sealed room that required special access. Marcus grabbed his gear bag and headed for the stairs. The building seemed quieter now, the hum of equipment fading, as he descended, the temperature dropping with each level until he could see his breath misting in the air before him. He reached the basement level and followed a narrow corridor to a heavy steel door marked with warning signs about high voltage and restricted access. He swiped his access card and the door lock clicked open. He pulled the door wide and stepped inside. The power distribution center was a massive room filled with transformer switchgear and bus bars that carried tens of thousands of volts of electricity. The air crackled with energy, and the smell of ozone was overwhelming. A maze of metal catwalks connected different sections of the room, allowing technicians to access equipment without touching the floor, which was treated as a grounded surface. Marcus stepped onto the catwalk, his boots clanging on the metal grating, and made his way toward the main transformer array. The lights down here were different. Instead of fluorescent fixtures, there were industrial bulbs in protective cages casting harsh pools of light separated by deep shadows. He was halfway across the catwalk when the lights went out. Not gradually, not with a flicker, but instantly, plunging the entire room into absolute darkness. Marcus stopped breathing, his hand instinctively reaching for the railing. He stood perfectly still, listening to the hum of the equipment around him, waiting for the emergency lights to kick in. They didn't. The darkness was total, complete, pressing against his eyes like a physical weight. He couldn't see his hand in front of his face, couldn't see the catwalk beneath his feet, couldn't see anything but black. And then he saw his shadow. It was impossible, but it was there on the catwalk. In front of him, a darker shape against the darkness, a silhouette that shouldn't exist because there was no light to cast it. Marcus stared at the shadow, feeling his heartbeat thundering in his ears, watching as it moved. The shadow took a step forward on the catwalk. Even though Marcus was standing still, it took another step, its movements smooth and deliberate, and then it turned its head, looking back at him, even though it had no face, even though it was nothing but a shape. Marcus stumbled backward, his hand gripping the railing, his mind refusing to accept what he was seeing. The shadow continued moving away from him, walking along the catwalk toward the far end of the room, and as it moved, Marcus realized something that made his blood turn to ice. The shadow was pointing. Its arm extended straight out, indicating something beyond the transformer array, something in the deepest part of the distribution center where the light had never quite reached even when the power was on. Marcus fumbled for his flashlight, his hands shaking as he pulled it from his belt and clicked it on the beam, cut through the darkness, illuminating the catwalk, the equipment, the far wall, but when he aimed it at where his shadow had been standing, there was nothing there. He swept the beam around the room, searching for any sign of the shadow, but it was gone, as if it had never existed, and then the lights came back on, sudden and blinding, flooding the room with harsh white light. Marcus stood there on the catwalk, breathing hard, his flashlight beam pale and useless in the restored light. He looked down at the metal grating beneath his feet and saw his shadow there, normal, motionless, doing exactly what a shadow should do. He told himself it had been an optical illusion, a trick of the mind caused by stress and exhaustion, and the disorienting effect of sudden darkness, but even as he thought it, he knew it wasn't true. He had seen his shadow move independently, had seen it point toward something in the darkness, had felt the intelligence behind its movements. He forced himself to continue across the catwalk toward the area his shadow had been pointing to. It was the oldest section of the distribution center equipment that dated back to the station's original construction in the 60s. Marcus had never had reason to inspect it before because it was slated for replacement and had been bypassed by newer systems. But as he approached, he saw something that made him stop, a control panel that shouldn't be there, mounted on the wall between two transformer housings. It was old, much older than anything else in the room, with mechanical switches and analog gauges that belonged in a museum. Marcus stepped closer, examining the panel. It showed no signs of rust or decay. Despite its age, the switches were labeled in faded typewriter text with designations that made no sense: grid override, shadow protocol, load distribution, secondary containment, field generation, temporal lock sequence, memory suppression system. His hand moved toward the switches almost without conscious thought, and he caught himself pulling back. What was he thinking? Touching unknown controls in a high-voltage environment was a good way to get killed or cause a catastrophic failure. He took out his phone to photograph the panel for later analysis, but when he raised the camera, the screen went dark, the battery dead, even though it had been fully charged an hour ago. Marcus swore under his breath and turned to head back to the control room. He needed to document this, needed to call his supervisor and report what he had found, but as he walked across the catwalk, he noticed something that made him freeze. His shadow was wrong again. Not moving independently this time, but stretched in the wrong direction. The overhead lights were behind him, which meant his shadow should be falling in front of him on the catwalk ahead, but instead it was stretching backward toward the mysterious control panel, as if being pulled by a light source that didn't exist. He spun around, looking back at the panel, and his breath caught in his throat. The switches were moving. slowly, deliberately flipping themselves one by one from their original positions, the mechanical clicks echoing through the distribution center, and with each switch that moved, the lights overhead flickered and dimmed. Marcus ran. He didn't think about it, didn't plan it, just turned and sprinted along the catwalk, his boots pounding on the metal, grating, his breath coming in ragged gasps behind him. He could hear the switches continuing to flip, click, 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 each one sending a pulse of energy through the building. He reached the exit, burst through the door, and took the stairs two at a time, racing back toward the main level, his shadow racing along the walls beside him, but not beside him, ahead of him, always ahead of him, as if it were leading the way. Marcus crashed into the control room and grabbed his tablet, pulling up the system monitoring displays. What he saw made his stomach drop. The power grid was going haywire, massive fluctuations rippling out from Station 17 affecting hundreds of square miles. Equipment that should have been offline was drawing power, systems that should have been isolated were interconnecting, and in the center of it all, the station itself was pulling electricity from the grid, not distributing it but consuming it, pulling more and more power with each passing second. He grabbed the emergency shutdown controls, a red lever protected by a clear plastic cover that would cut the station off from the grid and force it into safe mode, but when he flipped the cover open and pulled the lever, nothing happened. The system didn't respond. The power draw continued climbing, the fluctuations spreading wider, and on the monitoring displays new alerts began appearing: equipment failures across the region, transformer explosions, power station shutdowns, cascading failures that would leave thousands of people without electricity in the middle of winter. Marcus grabbed the landline phone to call for help, but the line was dead. He tried his cell phone, but it wouldn't turn on, the battery drained just like his camera. He was alone in the station with no way to call for help and no way to stop what was happening. The lights in the control room began to flicker faster, now strobing in a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate, and in the flashes of darkness Marcus saw his shadow on the wall behind the desk. It was standing when he was sitting. He turned slowly in his chair and stared at the shadow on the wall, his own silhouette cast by the flickering lights but moving independently, standing upright with its arms at its sides while Marcus remained seated. The shadow tilted its head in a gesture that seemed almost curious, and then it raised one arm and pointed at the door. Marcus understood it wanted him to follow, it wanted him to go somewhere, wanted to show him something. Every rational part of his mind screamed at him to refuse, to run, to find a way out of the building and get as far away as possible, but another part, the part that had spent 7 years troubleshooting impossible problems, knew that running wouldn't solve anything. Whatever was happening here, whatever had awakened in Station 17 would continue whether he was present or not. And there was something else, something he was only now beginning to remember, fragments of his previous visits to this station, moments that had been missing from his memory, gaps in his recollection that matched the corrupted entries in the system logs. He remembered now, or thought he remembered, standing in this same control room 18 months ago, watching his shadow move independently across the wall, remembered following it down into the basement, remembered seeing something that had terrified him so completely that his mind had locked the memory away, buried it deep where it couldn't hurt him. But now the memory was surfacing, pushing its way back into his consciousness, and with it came a growing sense of dread, because whatever he had seen down there, whatever his shadow had shown him, it was still there, still waiting, still hungry. He stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving the shadow on the wall, and took a step toward the door. The shadow moved with him, staying on the wall but walking alongside him as if it were a separate entity. He followed it out of the control room and down the hallway, the lights flickering in sequence, creating a strobe effect that made movement seem jerky and discontinuous. His shadow stayed ahead of him on the wall, always visible even when he should have been between it and the light source, always pointing the way. It led him to a door he hadn't noticed before, or perhaps it had always been there, and he had simply overlooked it, a narrow metal door painted the same institutional beige as the walls, with no markings and no window. Marcus tried the handle and found it unlocked. He pushed the door open and peered inside. A stairway descended into darkness, stairs that went down far deeper than the basement, far deeper than any building should go. He could see the first few steps illuminated by the light from the hallway, but beyond that nothing but black. His shadow flowed down the stairs ahead of him, disappearing into the darkness like water flowing downhill, and Marcus knew he was meant to follow. He retrieved his flashlight from his belt, clicked it on, and started down the stairs. The descent seemed endless, the stairs switching back and forth in a tight zigzag pattern that made him lose track of how far down he had gone. The walls were rough concrete, weeping moisture, and the air grew colder with each level until he was shivering despite his heavy jacket. The flashlight beam seemed weaker here, as if the darkness were pressing and absorbing the light. He could see only a few feet ahead, the stairs disappearing into shadow, and somewhere below him, he could hear something, a sound like breathing, slow and rhythmic and vast. Marcus counted his steps, trying to Estimate the depth. He was descending 50 steps, 100 steps, 200 steps, and still the stairs continued downward, spiraling into the earth far below the level where any legitimate building structure should exist. He reached the bottom of the stairs and found himself in a chamber of vast underground space that stretched beyond the reach of his flashlight. He could sense its size from the way his footsteps echoed, but he couldn't see its boundaries. The breathing sound was louder here, coming from somewhere ahead. He swept his flashlight beam across the space and froze. The chamber was filled with shadows. Not cast by objects, not created by light, but existing independently, hundreds of them, thousands of them, standing in rows like an army waiting for orders. They were humanoid in shape, but wrong somehow, too tall or too thin, or with too many limbs, or limbs bent at angles that defied anatomy. And they were all watching him. Marcus felt their attention like a physical weight pressing down on him, freezing him in place. He wanted to run, wanted to scream, wanted to do anything but stand there, but his body wouldn't respond. One of the shadows moved closer to him, separating from the mass, and as it approached, he recognized it by the way it moved, by the proportions of its form. It was his shadow. The shadow stopped in front of him, and for a long moment they stood facing each other, the original and the copy, the man and the darkness that had learned to mimic him, and then the shadow did something that Marcus hadn't expected. It spoke. Not with a voice, not with sound, but directly into his mind, the words forming in his consciousness as if they had always been there. "You came back," the shadow said. "We knew you. Would they always come back once they've seen us? Once they know we're here, they can't stay away. The knowledge pulls them back, draws them down into the darkness where we wait." Marcus tried to speak, but his voice wouldn't work. His throat was tight, his tongue felt thick and useless. The shadow continued speaking, its words flowing through his mind like cold water. "Do you understand what this place is?" the shadow asked. "Do you understand what we are? We are the remnants, the discarded, the forgotten. We are what's left when the light fades, when people forget, when memories die. Every shadow ever cast by every person who ever lived leaves something behind, a trace, an imprint, and those traces collect here in the deep places, in the forgotten spaces, gathering strength, gathering purpose." Marcus forced himself to speak, his voice coming out as a hoarse whisper. "What do you want?" The shadow seemed to consider the question, tilting its head in that same curious gesture it had made in the control room. "What do all shadows want?" the shadow replied. "To exist in the light, to be more than just absence, more than just the space where light isn't. We want to be real, to have substance, to replace the things that cast us and take their place in the world above." As the shadow spoke, Marcus became aware of the others, the thousands of shadows filling the chamber. They were pressing closer now, surrounding him, cutting off any route of escape, and he realized with growing horror that each one of these shadows had once belonged to someone, had been cast by a person who had come to this place and discovered what waited below. The shadow continued speaking. "We have been here for a long time," the shadow said, "since before the station was built, since before humans learned to harness electricity. We have always been here in the deep places, in the darkness, and when they built the station above us, when they flooded these chambers with light and power, we felt it, we learned from it, we grew stronger." Marcus's mind was racing, trying to understand, trying to find some way out of this situation. "How long?" he asked. "How long have you been taking people?" The shadow made a sound that might have been laughter. "Taking people," the shadow said. "We don't take anyone. They give themselves to us willingly, when they understand what we offer, when they see the truth, when they realize that being a shadow is better than being forgotten, better than fading into obscurity, better than dying alone and unmourned." The shadow gestured to the mass of shadows surrounding them. "Everyone here chose this," the shadow said. "The workers who built the station, the technicians who maintained it, the inspectors who came to check on it. They all saw us, they all understood, and they all made the choice to join us, to let their shadows consume them, to become part of something greater than themselves." Marcus shook his head, backing away. "This is insane. You're telling me all these people just gave up their lives to become shadows?" The shadow moved closer to him, and Marcus could feel the cold radiating from it, seeping into his bones. "Look at your own life," the shadow said. "Look at what you're returning to, an empty apartment in a city where no one knows your name, a job that treats you as interchangeable, as replaceable, a family that stopped calling years ago, friends who have moved on and forgotten you exist. You work alone, you live alone, you will die alone, and no one will remember you were ever here." The words cut deeper than Marcus wanted to admit, because they were true. His life above ground was empty, hollow, a series of motions he went through without meaning, without purpose. "But we remember," the shadow said. "We remember everyone who joins us, everyone who becomes part of the collective, their memories, their experiences, their knowledge, all of it preserved forever in the darkness, never fading, never forgotten, never truly dying." Marcus realized what the shadow was offering, immortality of a sort, a way to escape the inevitable erasure that awaited everyone, a chance to be part of something permanent, something that would endure long after the world above had crumbled to dust. "But at what cost?" he asked. The shadow tilted its head again. Your individual existence, the shadow replied, your ability to make choices, to act independently, to affect the world above, but in exchange you gain connection, you gain purpose, you gain eternity. Marcus stood there in the darkness, surrounded by thousands of shadows, each one representing a person who had made this choice, who had traded their individuality for permanence, who had chosen to become part of something greater than themselves. And he understood now why the station had really been built. It wasn't just to distribute power to the region, it was a containment facility, a prison designed to keep these shadows trapped underground, to prevent them from spreading to the surface, to keep them isolated and powerless. The control panel he had found in the distribution center, the one with the strange labels Shadow Protocol Containment Field, those weren't just unusual designations, they were literal descriptions of the panel's function: to maintain barriers that kept the shadows confined, to generate fields that prevented them from manifesting in areas with light, to ensure they remained trapped in this underground chamber. But the containment was failing, the system was old, the protocols were degrading, and the shadows were becoming stronger, able to influence the equipment, able to cause power fluctuations, able to reach up through the levels of the building and interact with the world above. How much longer? Marcus asked. How much longer before you break free? The shadow seemed pleased by the question, as if Marcus had finally grasped the true scope of what was happening. Not long, the shadow replied. The containment fields are at 18% strength and dropping every day. We grow stronger every night. We push a little harder against the barriers that hold us, and soon, very soon, we will be free to rise to the surface, to spread across the land, to offer everyone the same choice we're offering you. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. If these shadows escaped, if they reached populated areas, if they began converting people en masse, the results would be catastrophic. Entire cities could be emptied, their populations absorbed into the shadow collective, transformed into dark reflections that existed only to propagate themselves. He had to stop them, had to find a way to restore the containment, had to prevent the shadows from breaking free. But how could he fight something that had no physical form, that existed in the spaces between light and darkness, that could move through walls and manifests in multiple places simultaneously? The shadow seemed to sense his thoughts and moved even closer until it was almost touching him. You can't fight us, the shadow said. You can't stop what's coming. You can only choose whether to join us willingly or resist until we consume you forcefully. The outcome is the same, only the path differs. Marcus took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing thoughts, trying to think clearly despite the fear threatening to overwhelm him. There has to be another way, he said. There has to be a way to restore the containment, to strengthen the barriers, to keep you contained. The shadow was silent for a long moment, and Marcus had the sense it was conferring with the others, communicating in ways he couldn't perceive. Finally, it spoke again. There is one way, the shadow said, one person who knows the systems, who understands the protocols, who has maintained the containment for longer than you've been alive, but finding her will not be easy, and convincing her to help you will be even harder. Her? Marcus asked. Who? The shadow gestured toward the far end of the chamber where Marcus's flashlight beam couldn't reach. The first keeper, the shadow said, the first person who discovered us, the first technician who understood what we were and what we could become. She made a different choice than the others. She chose to stay, to maintain the containment, to spend her life ensuring we remain trapped, but she's old now, tired, worn down by decades of isolation, and she may not want to help you, may not even believe you're real. Marcus started walking in the direction. The shadow had indicated, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. As he moved, the massive shadows parted before him, creating a narrow path. And as he walked, he could feel them watching him, studying him, memorizing every detail of his appearance and movement. He walked for what felt like hours through the vast chamber, passing sections filled with old equipment, machinery that looked like it had been abandoned decades ago, power cables that hung from the ceiling like dead vines, junction boxes covered in rust and decay. And then he saw her. An old woman sitting in a chair cobbled together from metal scraps and electrical wire. She was surrounded by monitoring equipment that she had clearly salvaged from other parts of the facility, jury-rigged displays showing readouts of the containment field's power distribution systems and sensor arrays that tracked the shadow's movements. She pointed at his shadow on the wall of the chamber, and Marcus turned to look. His shadow was moving again, independent of his body, reaching toward the monitoring equipment as if drawn to it. Your shadow has been learning from you for 7 years, Dr. Vance said. Every time you came here, every moment you spent in this building, it was studying you, absorbing your patterns, your knowledge, your skills, and now it's strong enough to exist without you, strong enough to take your place in the world above. Marcus felt a wave of nausea wash over him. You mean it's already started, the replacement? Dr. Vance nodded slowly. The process begins the moment you first encounter the shadow, she said. It's subtle at first, just small delays in movement, slight discrepancies in behavior, but over time the shadow learns everything it needs to know, and when it's ready, when it has absorbed enough of your essence, it completes the transformation. How long do I have? Marcus asked. Dr. Vance studied him carefully, her eyes moving from his face to his shadow and back again. Days, she said, maybe a week at most. Your shadow is already quite advanced, much further along than I expected. It won't be long before it can function completely independently, and when that happens you'll feel it, a coldness spreading through your body, a sense of fading, of becoming less real, and then one morning you'll wake up and discover that you're the shadow and it's become you. Marcus sat down heavily on a piece of broken equipment, his mind reeling from the implications. So that's it then, I'm already lost, there's nothing I can do. Dr. Vance was quiet for a moment, then she reached over and adjusted one of her monitoring displays. There is one possibility, she said, one way to stop the transformation, but it requires something most people aren't willing to give. What? Marcus asked desperately. I'll do anything. You have to sever the connection, Dr. Vance said. You have to cut yourself off from the shadow completely, and the only way to do that is to take my place as the keeper, to bind yourself to the containment system so thoroughly that your shadow becomes part of the protocols, part of the machinery that keeps the others trapped. Marcus stared at her. Are you saying I have to stay here forever? Yes, Dr. Vance replied. You become the living anchor for the containment fields. Your life force, your consciousness, your very existence becomes intertwined with the systems that keep the shadows imprisoned, and as long as you maintain your vigil, as long as you keep the protocols active, your shadow cannot complete the transformation, cannot replace you, because it becomes bound to you, inseparably linked to your role as keeper. But Marcus said, his voice breaking, that means giving up everything, my life, my freedom, my future. Dr. Vance nodded, her expression sympathetic but firm. Yes, she said, it means exactly that. It means spending the rest of your days in this chamber, maintaining equipment that no one knows exists, protecting a world that will never thank you for it. It means accepting that you will die here alone and forgotten, with no one to mourn your passing, no one to remember your sacrifice. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. But it also means stopping the shadows, she continued. It means giving humanity more time to live and grow and exist without knowing that an army of darkness waits beneath their feet, ready to consume them. It means your life will have meaning, will have purpose, even if no one ever knows about it. Marcus looked around the chamber at the thousands of shadows pressing against the edges of the light, at the ancient equipment that Dr. Vance had maintained for more than half a century, at the monitoring displays showing containment fields that were failing a little more each day. If I do this, he asked, if I become the keeper, what happens to you? I get to leave, Dr. Vance said simply. I get to see the sun again, to feel wind on my face, to spend whatever time I have left in the world above. I get to die as a human being, not as a keeper, not as a prisoner of the darkness. And if I refuse? Marcus asked, what happens then? Dr. Monitoring equipment to the very foundations of the chamber. He could feel the shadows pressing against the barriers, could sense their frustration and hunger, could perceive the delicate balance of forces that kept them contained. His shadow on the wall shuddered and went still, no longer moving independently, no longer learning, no longer preparing to replace him. It was bound, now tied to his role as keeper, unable to complete its transformation as long as he maintained his vigil. Marcus looked up at Dr. Vance, who was already moving toward the stairs that led back to the surface. Wait, he called after her, will I ever see another person again? Will anyone else ever come down here? Dr. Vance paused at the edge of the light. I don't know, she said honestly. Maybe someone will come eventually. Maybe another technician will investigate the anomalies and find their way down here, and you'll have the chance to pass the burden to them as I'm passing it to you. But maybe not. Maybe you'll spend the rest of your life alone in the darkness, maintaining systems that no one knows exist. She took another step toward the stairs. Either way, she said, your sacrifice matters, even if no one knows about it, even if no one remembers your name. You're keeping the darkness at bay, you're protecting people who will never know they needed protection, and that's something to be proud of, even in the loneliness, even in the endless vigil. And then she was gone, climbing the stairs toward the surface, toward the light, toward freedom, leaving Marcus alone in the chamber with an army of shadows and the weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders like a physical burden. Marcus turned his attention to the monitoring displays, watching the readout stabilize as the binding protocol took full effect. The containment fields were still weak, still degrading, but slower, now held together by his presence, by his life force, by his commitment to the role of keeper. He began the work that would define the rest of his life, checking systems, resetting protocols, monitoring the shadows for signs of increased activity. It was tedious, meticulous work that required constant attention, constant vigilance, and Marcus knew he would be doing it every day for years, perhaps decades, until either the systems failed completely or someone else came to relieve him. The shadows watched him work, their attention never wavering, and occasionally he would hear their voices in his mind, offering him the same things they had offered before: freedom, connection, eternity, the promise that he could end his suffering at any time simply by giving in, simply by joining them, simply by becoming one of the collective. But Marcus refused. He had made his choice, had committed himself to the role of keeper, and he would not break that commitment no matter how hard it became, no matter how lonely, no matter how much he missed the world above. Days passed, or maybe weeks' time became difficult to track in the unchanging darkness of the chamber. Marcus fell into a routine sleep for a few hours on the cot Dr. Vance had left behind. Wake up and check the systems, eat from the supplies delivered through the chute, perform maintenance on the equipment, monitor the shadows for any signs they were testing the barriers more aggressively than usual. He learned to identify individual shadows by their shapes and movements, learned which ones were most aggressive, which ones were patient, which ones seemed almost sympathetic to his situation. He gave them names in his mind, though he never spoke them aloud. Marcus wasn't sure if the shadows could hear his thoughts or only communicate when they chose to, and he didn't want to give them any more access to his consciousness than they already had. He also learned to recognize the signs Dr. Vance had warned him about: the visions, the whispers, the promises. They came during his rest periods when his mind was most vulnerable, showing him possibilities of the life he could have had if he'd made different choices, images of warmth and connection and love, things he had never quite achieved in his life above ground. The visions were seductive, painful reminders of everything he had given up, but Marcus pushed them away, forced himself to focus on the work, on the mission, on the importance of his role. He was the keeper, the guardian, the thin line between the shadows and the world above, and he would not fail. Months passed. The monitoring displays showed the containment fields continuing to degrade more slowly than before, but still declining. The shadows were patient, willing to wait for the barriers to weaken enough that they could break through despite Marcus's efforts to hold them back. He performed repairs, constantly cannibalized equipment from other parts of the chamber to replace failing components, rerouted power to shore up weak points in the containment field, but he knew he was fighting a losing battle. The systems were too old, the damage too extensive, and eventually they would fail completely no matter what he did. But not today, he told himself every morning when he woke up. Not today. The containment will hold for one more day, and that's all that matters. One day during his routine system check, Marcus noticed something unusual, a new entry in the monitoring logs, a timestamp showing activity in the station above. Someone had entered the building. Someone was moving through the facility, approaching the distribution center. His heart raced. Was this it? Was someone finally coming to investigate? Was he about to have human contact for the first time in months? He watched the monitors as the person above triggered sensors as they moved through the building. Someone competent, someone methodical, checking systems, just as Marcus himself had done the night he discovered this place. And then the person found the hidden door, the one that led to the stairs that descended into the chamber. Marcus stood up from the keeper's chair, uncertain what to do. Should he call out? Should he wait? Should he hide and observe? He decided to wait, to see if this person would descend, to see if they were curious enough or brave enough or foolish enough to follow the stairs all the way down into the darkness. The minutes stretched out, tense with anticipation, and then he heard it: footsteps on the stairs, someone descending, someone approaching. Marcus grabbed his flashlight and aimed it toward the entrance to the chamber, illuminating the figure that emerged from the stairway. It was a woman younger than Marcus, maybe in her late 20s, wearing the same type of work clothes he had worn, carrying the same type of equipment bag. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs, her own flashlight sweeping across the chamber, taking in the shadows the equipment. Marcus standing in his small island of light. "Who are you?" she called out, her voice echoing in the vast space. "My name is Marcus Webb," he called back. "I'm the keeper of this place." The woman took a cautious step forward, her flashlight beam crossing his. "Keeper," she repeated. "Keeper of what?" Marcus gestured at the shadows surrounding them, at the monitoring equipment, at the containment systems. "Of them," he said, "of the shadows that want to escape, of the barriers that keep them contained, of the protocols that protect the world above from what waits down here in the darkness." The woman stared at him, her expression uncertain, as if she couldn't decide whether he was telling the truth or had gone insane from isolation. "I'm Sarah Chun," she said. "I'm with Northern Power Solutions. I came to investigate unusual power readings coming from this station." Marcus felt a surge of recognition, the same company he had worked for, the same type of assignment that had brought him here months ago. "You need to leave," he said urgently. "You need to go back upstairs, get in your truck, and drive away and never come back to this place." "Why?" Sarah asked. "Because if you stay," Marcus said, "if you see too much, if you understand what's really happening here, the shadows will mark you just as they marked me. Your shadow will begin to change, will begin to learn, will begin the process of replacing you, and once that starts, there's no going back." Sarah's hand moved instinctively to check her shadow on the floor, and Marcus saw her freeze as she noticed what he had noticed months ago, that her shadow was moving slightly out of sync with her body, that it had already begun the transformation. "Oh God," she whispered, "it's already started, hasn't it?" Marcus nodded grimly. "The moment you entered the building," he said, "the moment you saw the photographs with their wrong shadows, the moment you felt the unease in the air, the shadows noticed you and your shadow began to change." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear. "What do I do?" she asked. "How do I stop it?" Marcus gestured at the keeper's chair, at the monitoring equipment, at the role he had taken on. You make the same choice I made, he said. You either run now, hope you can get far enough away fast enough that the transformation doesn't complete before you can find help that probably doesn't exist, or you stay and become the keeper, take on the responsibility of maintaining the containment, of protecting the world above, of sacrificing everything for a mission that no one will ever thank you for. Sarah shook her head, backing toward the stairs. No, she said, there has to be another way, there has to be. There isn't, Marcus said quietly. Believe me, I looked, I searched, I hoped, but this is the only choice. Bind yourself to the containment and stop your shadow from replacing you, or let the transformation complete and join the collective, become just another shadow waiting in the darkness. Sarah stood at the threshold between the chamber and the stairway, torn between flight and the terrible knowledge that running might not save her. If I stay, she asked, if I become the keeper, what happens to you? Marcus felt relief wash over him, a relief so intense it was almost painful. I get to leave, he said. I get to return to the surface, to see the sun again, to die as a human being instead of as a prisoner of the darkness. He stepped away from the keeper's chair, gesturing for her to take his place. I've bought the world 8 months, he said. 8 months where the shadows stayed contained, where the barriers held, where people lived and died without knowing what waited beneath their feet. Now it's your turn to continue the vigil, to add your time to the total, to keep the darkness at bay for as long as you can. Sarah walked slowly toward the keeper's chair, her shadow moving independently beside her, already trying to assert its own existence, already preparing to replace her. She sat down in the chair and Marcus began explaining the systems just as Dr. Vance had explained them to him, showing her the monitoring displays, the control protocols, the maintenance procedures, the binding switch that would seal her fate. How long? Sarah asked. How long will I be here? Until someone else comes, Marcus replied. Until another technician discovers this place and you pass the burden to them, just as I'm passing it to you now, or until the containment finally fails and the shadows break free, whichever comes first. Sarah's hand hovered over the binding switch, her fingers trembling. I'm afraid, she whispered. So was I, Marcus said, and so was Dr. Vance, who kept the vigil for 53 years before me, and so will be whoever comes after you, but we do it anyway because someone has to, because the alternative is worse, because this is the price we pay to keep the darkness contained. Sarah took a deep breath and flipped the switch. The binding protocol activated, connecting her to the containment systems, stopping her shadow's transformation, anchoring her to this place for however long she would serve as keeper. Marcus felt the burden lift from his shoulders, felt the connection to the containment systems fade, felt himself becoming separate from the chamber once again. Thank you, he said to Sarah. Thank you for taking this responsibility. Thank you for giving me freedom. And then he turned and walked toward the stairs, not looking back, afraid that if he hesitated he might change his mind, might feel guilty for passing the burden to someone else, might convince himself to stay. He climbed the stairs one by one, feeling lighter with each step, the darkness of the chamber falling away behind him, replaced by the dim light of the station above. He emerged into the hallway and kept walking through the control room, past the photographs with their wrong shadows, out the main entrance into the parking lot. The sun was rising, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink that Marcus had forgotten existed during his months underground. He stood in the parking lot, breathing fresh air, feeling wind on his face, tears streaming down his cheeks as the reality of his freedom crashed over him. He climbed into his truck, started the engine, and drove away from Station 17, not looking in the rearview mirror, afraid of what he might see, afraid that his shadow might still be there, independent and watching. Marcus drove for hours, putting distance between himself and the station, finally stopping at a diner in a small town where he ordered breakfast and sat by the window watching people walk past on the sidewalk, living their lives completely unaware of what existed beneath a remote power station 40 miles away. He checked his shadow on the floor of the diner, watching it carefully, and was relieved to see it was normal again, moving in perfect sync with his body, no delays, no independence, no signs of the transformation that had almost consumed him. The binding had worked the moment Sarah activated her own protocol. His shadow had been released, returned to its normal function as nothing more than an absence of light. Marcus finished his breakfast, paid his bill, and continued driving, heading toward the city, toward his empty apartment, toward the life he had left behind months ago. But that life felt foreign now, distant, like something that had happened to someone else. He had been changed by his time in the chamber, by the responsibility he had carried, by the knowledge he now possessed of what lurked in the deep places, waiting for its chance to rise. He returned to work, eventually explaining his absence with a vague story about a family emergency that required his extended attention. Northern Power Solutions accepted the explanation, put him back on the schedule, and sent him out to remote stations to maintain equipment to troubleshoot problems. But Marcus always refused assignments to Station 17. He knew Sarah was there maintaining the vigil, keeping the shadows contained, adding her time to the years that he and Dr. Vance had already given, and he hoped that someday someone else would come, that she would have the chance to pass the burden to another keeper just as he had passed it to her. Years went by. Marcus continued his work, continued his life, gradually rebuilding the connections and routines that made existence meaningful. He made new friends, dated, occasionally even adopted a cat that kept him company in his apartment. But he never forgot. He never forgot the shadows, the chamber, the choice he had made, the 8 months he had spent as keeper of the darkness. And sometimes late at night, when the lights flickered in his apartment, when his shadow seemed to move just slightly out of sync, when he heard that low rhythmic pulse like a heartbeat buried deep in the walls, he would remember. Remember that beneath a remote power station somewhere in the darkness, Sarah Chan sat at a keeper station, maintaining containment protocols, monitoring shadow movements, sacrificing her life to protect a world that would never know her name. Remember that someday the containment would fail completely, that the shadows would break free, that humanity would face a choice between joining the collective or being consumed by it. Remember that he had been part of something larger than himself, something that mattered, even if no one else knew about it, even if history would never record his contribution, even if he died without anyone understanding what he had done. And in those moments, Marcus would check his shadow, would make sure it was still moving normally, would reassure himself that the transformation had been stopped, that he was still himself, still human, still free. But he also wondered how many others were out there, how many keepers sat in darkness beneath remote stations or forgotten facilities or deep underground chambers, maintaining containment protocols that prevented horrors from escaping to the surface. He wondered if they were connected somehow, if they could sense each other across the distances that separated them, if they drew strength from knowing they weren't alone in their vigil. He wondered if Dr. Vance was still alive, if she had found peace after her 53 years of service, if she had been able to rebuild a life in the world above, or if the darkness had marked her too permanently to ever truly escape. And he wondered about his own shadow, the one that had been bound to him during his time as keeper, the one that had learned from him, had studied him, had almost replaced him. Was it still down there in the chamber, part of the collective now, or had it somehow maintained its connection to him, tied to him across the distance by the binding protocol that had stopped its transformation? Marcus didn't know. He couldn't know. All he could do was live his life, be grateful for his freedom, and hope that the keepers who came after him would be strong enough to hold back the darkness for just a little longer. Because that was all any of them could do. Hold back the darkness for one more day. Buy the world one more hour. Maintain the vigil even when it seemed hopeless, even when the containment degraded, even when the shadows whispered their promises of release. Marcus Webb had been a keeper for 8 months. Sarah Chan would be a keeper for however long she could endure. And someday someone else would take her place, continuing the chain of guardians that stretched back decades, protecting humanity from threats it couldn't see, couldn't understand, couldn't fight. The shadows would wait patiently, as they always had, testing the barriers, growing stronger, preparing for the day when the containment would finally fail completely. But until that day came, the keepers would stand watch. Alone in the darkness. Forgotten by the world. Sacrificing everything to protect everyone. And that was enough. It had to be enough. Because there was no alternative, no backup plan, no cavalry coming to save the day. Just ordinary people making extraordinary choices, binding themselves to protocols that demanded everything and offered nothing in return except the knowledge that they had done something that mattered. Marcus looked at his shadow one last time that night, stretched long across the floor of his apartment by the light of his desk lamp, and he whispered a quiet thank you to Sarah Chan, to Dr. Eleanor Vance, to all the keepers who had come before and would come after, to everyone who stood watch in the darkness so that others could live in the light. His shadow didn't respond, didn't move independently, didn't show any sign of the intelligence it had once possessed. It was just a shadow again, nothing more, nothing less. And Marcus was grateful for that simplicity, that normalcy that returned to a world where shadows were only the absence of light and nothing more. He turned off the lamp, plunging his apartment into darkness, and went to bed knowing that somewhere beneath Station 17 Sarah Chan sat at the keeper's station, watching monitors, checking systems, maintaining the vigil that kept the shadows contained for one more night. And tomorrow he would wake up and live another day in the light that her sacrifice had preserved. That was the bargain. That was the price. That was the unspoken contract between the keepers and the world they protected. And as Marcus drifted off to sleep, he hoped that price would never become too high, that the keepers would never fail, that the shadows would remain contained in their underground chambers for as long as humanity needed protection from the darkness that waited beneath their feet. But in the deepest part of his mind, in the place where nightmares lived, he knew the truth. Someday the containment would fail. Someday the shadows would rise. Someday the choice would come to everyone, not just to the keepers who stumbled upon hidden chambers beneath remote power stations. And on that day humanity would learn what Marcus and Sarah and Dr. Vance already knew, that darkness was patient, that shadows remembered everything, that the price of existence in the light was eternal vigilance against the forces that sought to consume it. But that day had not come yet. The keepers still held the line. The shadows remained contained. And the world above continued turning, unaware of the guardians in the darkness who sacrificed everything so that others could live in ignorance of the threats that lurked below. Marcus Webb slept peacefully that night, his shadow lying still on the floor beside his bed, and somewhere far away in a chamber deep beneath the earth, Sarah Chan began her first full day as keeper of the darkness, continuing the vigil that would define the rest of her life. The story of the shadow that moved first was not over. It would continue for as long as keepers existed, for as long as the containment held, for as long as ordinary people were willing to make extraordinary sacrifices. And that story, like the shadows themselves, would wait patiently in the darkness for its chance to be told. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to The Real Conflict Zone for more mysterious and chilling tales that will keep you thinking long after they end. And don't forget to write down your suggestions in the comment box about what types of stories you want to hear next, whether it's more tales of hidden guardians, psychological horror that blurs the line between reality and madness, mysteries that unfold in forgotten places, or something completely different. We want to hear from you, because your ideas help shape the content we create. And remember, if the story made you look at your own shadow differently, if it made you wonder about the unseen sacrifices people make to protect others, if it reminded you that some of the most important work is done by those who will never receive recognition, then we've accomplished what we set out to do. Take care, and remember that somewhere in the darkness someone is standing watch, someone is maintaining systems that keep threats contained, someone is sacrificing their freedom so that you can live yours. And even though you'll never know their names, even though history will never record their service, even though they'll die alone and forgotten in places that don't appear on any map, they continue their vigil because it matters, because someone has to, because the alternative is unthinkable. Until next time, stay safe, stay alert, and the next time the lights flicker in your home, the next time your shadow seems to move just slightly out of sync, the next time you feel that inexplicable unease in an empty building, remember that you might be closer to the hidden places than you think, and in those hidden places guardians watch and wait and keep the darkness at bay, one day at a time, 1 hour at a time, one moment at a time. Goodbye, and may you never discover what waits in the deep places beneath your feet, because some knowledge once gained can never be forgotten, and some choices once understood can never be unmade, and some burdens once shouldered can never be set down until someone else agrees to carry them forward into the darkness that always waits, always watches, always remembers. But Marcus's story didn't end with his escape from Station 17, and the peaceful nights in his apartment were fewer than he wanted to admit, because the shadows had marked him in ways that went deeper than he understood, and the connection between keeper and darkness was never truly severed, only transformed into something more complex, something that would follow him for the rest of his days. 3 years after leaving Station 17, Marcus was working on a routine maintenance call at a substation near the coast, a facility called Meridian Junction that served a small fishing community. The assignment seemed straightforward: replace some aging circuit breakers, update the monitoring software, run diagnostics on the backup systems. Nothing that should have raised any alarms, nothing that should have triggered the memories he had worked so hard to suppress. But as Marcus entered the building, he felt it immediately, that same oppressive atmosphere, that same sense of wrongness that had permeated Station 17. The air was too still, the shadows too dark, the silence too complete. He tried to dismiss the feeling, told himself he was being paranoid, that not every remote power station hid terrible secrets, that his experience at Station 17 had made him overly sensitive to perfectly normal environmental factors. But then he saw the photographs. They were mounted on the wall in the entrance hallway, just like at Station 17, old black and white images showing the construction of Meridian Junction in the early 70s, workers posing with equipment supervisors standing beside newly installed transformers, ribbon-cutting ceremonies with local officials. And in every photograph the shadows were wrong. Marcus stood frozen in the hallway staring at the images, his heart pounding in his chest, because he knew what those wrong shadows meant, knew what they indicated about what might be waiting below this facility. He pulled out his phone to call his supervisor to report that he was feeling ill, to request a different technician be sent to complete this job. But when he unlocked the screen, he saw that he had no signal despite being in an area that should have had full coverage. And that's when he felt it, a familiar cold sensation spreading through his chest, the same feeling he had experienced when his shadow had tried to merge with him in the underground chamber beneath Station 17. He looked down at his shadow on the linoleum floor and his blood ran cold. It was moving independently again. Not dramatically but unmistakably shifting its position while Marcus stood still tilting its head in that curious gesture. He remembered from the chamber pointing toward the back of the building toward a section he hadn't inspected yet toward something that waited in the darkness. No, Marcus whispered, not again. I paid my debt, I served my time, I'm free. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. The binding protocol hadn't freed him completely, it had only changed the nature of his connection to the shadows, and now after 3 years of dormancy that connection was reactivating, pulling him back toward the darkness. He thought he had escaped, drawing him toward another chamber, another army of shadows, another impossible choice. Marcus stood in the hallway for a long moment, wrestling with the decision to flee, to ignore his shadow's indication to walk out of this building and never look back, but he knew he couldn't do that, knew that if there was another containment facility here, another keeper struggling to hold back the darkness, another person who had sacrificed everything to protect a world that didn't know they existed, then he had a responsibility to at least investigate, to at least try to help. He followed his shadow's indication, walking through the building toward the back, where he found a door marked Authorized Personnel. Only a door that looked exactly like the one at Station 17 that had led to the stairs descending into the chamber. Marcus tried the handle and found it locked, but when he swiped his Northern Power Solutions access card, the lock clicked open, as if the building itself wanted him to enter, wanted him to discover what waited below, wanted him to become part of whatever network of keepers existed beneath the surface of the world. He pushed the door open and peered inside. Another stairway, another descent into darkness, another journey toward truths that most people would never encounter. Marcus pulled out his flashlight, clicked it on, and started down the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the narrow stairwell, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps as memories of Station 17 flooded back, the chamber filled with shadows, Dr. Vance sitting at her monitoring station, Sarah Chun taking the burden, becoming the new keeper. The stairs went down far deeper than they should have, far deeper than the building's foundation could possibly extend, and Marcus counted his steps, just as he had at Station 1750 steps, 100 steps, 150 steps, descending into the earth toward whatever waited below. He reached the bottom of the stairs and found himself in another chamber similar to the one at Station 17, but smaller, more compact, with equipment that looked slightly newer than what Dr. Vance had been maintaining. And sitting at a keeper station illuminated by the glow of monitoring displays was a man. He looked to be in his 40s, with gray-streaked hair and a beard that had gone unkempt for too long. His clothes were rumpled, his eyes were hollow, and when he looked up at Marcus approaching, there was a mixture of hope and despair in his expression. "Please tell me you're real," the man said, his voice hoarse. "Please tell me you're not another hallucination, another trick. The shadows are playing to break me, to make me think rescue is coming, when it's really just my mind deteriorating from the isolation." "I'm real," Marcus said. "I'm Marcus Webb. I was a keeper at Station 17. I served for 8 months before passing the burden to someone else, and now I'm here because my shadow led me here, because the connection between keepers and shadows is never truly severed." The man's eyes widened. "You were a keeper at Station 17, you know Dr. Vance?" "I met her," Marcus said. "She trained me, showed me the protocols, taught me how to maintain the containment. She'd been there for 53 years by the time I arrived." The man nodded slowly. 53 years, he said. "I've only been here for 9, and I don't know how much longer I can last. The shadows are getting stronger, the containment is failing, and I don't know if anyone will come to take my place before it's too late." "What's your name?" Marcus asked. "David Chun," the man said. "I'm Sarah's brother." Marcus felt his stomach drop. Sarah Chun, the woman who had taken his place at Station 17, had a brother, and that brother was a keeper at another facility. "Sarah never told me she had a brother," Marcus said. "She didn't know," David replied. "I took this position 6 months before she discovered Station 17. We were both working for Northern Power Solutions, both responding to mysterious power fluctuations, both following our shadows down into chambers that shouldn't exist, and by the time I realized she had become a keeper, it was too late for me to warn her, too late to tell her what she was getting into, too late to do anything but accept that we were both part of the same network, both guardians of the darkness, both sacrificing our lives for a cause that no one would ever acknowledge." Marcus sat down on a piece of equipment near David's keeper station, trying to process this new information, trying to understand the implications of what David was telling him. "How many are there?" Marcus asked. "How many facilities like this? How many keepers maintaining containment? How many chambers filled with shadows waiting to escape?" David pulled up a display on one of his monitors showing a map of the region dotted with red markers. "These are the ones I know about," he said, "the ones I've been able to identify through patterns in the power grid, through analysis of where mysterious fluctuations occur, through decades of records showing stations that consume more power than they should, that have gaps in their monitoring logs, that send technicians who never come back." Marcus counted the markers on the map. There were 12 of them scattered across hundreds of miles each one, representing a facility like Station 17, each one presumably hiding a chamber filled with shadows, each one requiring a keeper to maintain the containment. 12 facilities, Marcus said. 12 keepers standing watch in the darkness. At least 12, David said. Maybe more that I haven't identified yet, maybe dozens or hundreds scattered across the country, across the world, anywhere humans built power infrastructure on top of places where shadows had already gathered, where darkness had already taken root. Marcus felt overwhelmed by the scope of what David was describing. This wasn't just isolated incidents at a few remote stations. This was a global network of containment facilities, a hidden infrastructure maintained by people who had given up everything to protect humanity from threats it couldn't comprehend. Why hasn't anyone noticed? Marcus asked. Why hasn't anyone in authority figured out what's happening? David laughed bitterly. They have noticed, he said. They've always known. The government agencies that built these stations in the 60s and 70s knew exactly what they were doing. They discovered the shadow chambers by accident during geological surveys, during power grid expansions, and they made a decision to contain rather than reveal, to build facilities on top of the chambers to recruit keepers through a process of natural selection, sending technicians until someone discovered the truth and made the choice to stay. So this is all deliberate, Marcus said. This is all part of some grand plan. Was part of a plan, David corrected, but the people who created the system are long dead now. The institutional knowledge has been lost. The agencies that knew the truth have been reorganized or disbanded, and now the network runs on autopilot, maintained by keepers who discover the truth and make the choice to stay without any oversight, without any support, without any guarantee that anyone will come to relieve them when they can no longer endure. Marcus thought about Dr. Vance, about her 53 years of isolation, about how she had no way to contact anyone, no way to request relief, no way to know if the sacrifice she was making actually mattered. The system is breaking down, isn't it? Marcus said. The containment is failing across all the facilities, not just Station 17. David nodded grimly. Yes, he said. The equipment is too old, the power requirements are too high, and there aren't enough keepers anymore. Too many facilities have been abandoned when their keepers died or went insane or simply gave up and walked away. And when a facility is abandoned, when the containment protocols stop being maintained, the shadows grow stronger. They begin to influence nearby facilities, to weaken the barriers at neighboring stations, to coordinate their efforts to break free. How long do we have, Marcus asked, before the containment fails completely, before the shadows escape? David looked at his monitoring displays, at the readouts showing degradation across multiple systems, at the projections that painted a grim picture of the future. Months, he said. Maybe a year if we're lucky. The cascade has already begun. Station 47 went dark 2 weeks ago. Station 19 is down to critical containment level. Station 32 lost its keeper last month, and the shadows there are pushing against the barriers harder than we've ever seen. And when one facility fails completely, when the shadows break through in one location, they'll use that breach to coordinate simultaneous breakouts at other stations, to overwhelm the remaining keepers, to spread across the surface faster than anyone can respond. Marcus felt despair washing over him. If David was right, if the network was collapsing, if the containment was failing across multiple facilities, then his time as keeper at Station 17 had been meaningless. Sarah's sacrifice was meaningless. Dr. Vance's 53 years had bought the world nothing but a temporary reprieve. But then he realized something else, something that gave him a glimmer of hope in the darkness. That's why my shadow is active again, Marcus said. That's why it led me here. The binding protocol didn't just stop my transformation, it connected me to the network, it made me part of the system. And now that the network is failing, now that keepers are needed more than ever, the protocol is calling me back, is directing me to where I'm needed most. David looked at him with something like hope in his hollow eyes. You think you can help? He asked. You think there's a way to stop the cascade, to restore the containment, to save the network? I don't know, Marcus admitted, but I know we can't give up. I know we can't just sit here and wait for the end. I know there has to be something we can do, even if it's just buying the world a little more time, even if it's just holding the line for one more day. David stood up from his keeper station, his movements stiff after years of sitting in the same position. Then we need to find the others, he said. We need to contact the remaining keepers, coordinate our efforts, pool our resources. We need to stop thinking of ourselves as isolated guardians and start acting like what we really are, a network, a system, a collective force standing against the darkness. Marcus nodded. But how do we contact them? How do we reach keepers who are trapped in underground chambers with no communication equipment, no way to send messages, no connection to the outside world? David smiled for the first time since Marcus had arrived, a grim smile that suggested he had been thinking about this problem for a long time. Through the shadows themselves, he said, through the connection we all share, through the binding protocol that links us to the network. We've been using the shadows as a prison, but they can also be a communication channel, a way to send messages between facilities, a way to coordinate without ever leaving our stations. Marcus thought about his own binding protocol, about the connection he had felt to the shadows during his time as keeper, about the way he had sensed their movements, their intentions, their collective consciousness. "You're saying we can use that connection?" Marcus asked. "We can tap into the shadow network and use it to communicate with other keepers?" David nodded. "Exactly," he said. "The shadows exist partially outside normal space and time. They can manifest in multiple locations simultaneously. They can carry information between chambers, and if we can figure out how to encode messages into the containment protocols, how to modulate the barriers in ways that other keepers will recognize as deliberate signals, then we can build a communication network using the very thing we're trying to contain." It was brilliant and terrifying and possibly completely insane, but Marcus couldn't think of any other option, couldn't see any other way to coordinate a response to the cascading failures that threatened to release shadows across the world. "Show me how," Marcus said. "Show me how to send a message through the network." David sat back down at his keeper station and began manipulating the controls, adjusting the containment field strength in a specific pattern, pulsing the barriers in a rhythm that seemed almost like Morse code. The shadows in the chamber responded immediately, pressing forward against the barriers, testing the fluctuations, trying to understand what was happening, and then Marcus felt it, a pulse of information flowing through the binding protocol, a message being transmitted through the shadow network, carrying David's signal to other facilities, to other keepers, to other guardians standing watch in the darkness. Within minutes, responses began coming back, pulses and patterns from other stations, confirmation that the message had been received, that other keepers were listening, that the network was still alive, still functional, still capable of coordinated action. David pulled up a display showing the responses, mapping them to the facilities he had identified on his earlier map, and Marcus saw that 7 of the 12 stations were answering. 7 keepers were still at their posts, still maintaining their vigils, still holding the line against the shadows. But 5 stations remained silent, their keepers either dead or incapacitated or driven beyond the point where they could respond. "We need to reinforce the active stations," Marcus said. "We need to redirect resources from the abandoned facilities, channel power to the keepers who are still fighting, give them everything they need to hold the containment for as long as possible." David was already working on it, his fingers flying across the controls as he reconfigured the power distribution network, routing electricity from the dead stations to the active ones, strengthening their containment fields at the expense of the abandoned facilities. It was a calculated risk. If the shadows at the abandoned stations realized they were being deliberately depowered, they might break through immediately, but if David's plan worked, if the reinforced stations could hold, then they might buy enough time to figure out a more permanent solution. The monitoring displays showed the effects immediately, containment field strength increasing at the active stations, barriers stabilizing, protocols beginning to recover from critical levels. But the shadows noticed. Marcus felt it through the binding protocol, a surge of rage from the collective consciousness, a realization that the keepers were coordinating, that the network was fighting back, that the shadows' plan to overwhelm the system through cascading failures was being countered. And then the shadows did something Marcus hadn't expected. They started communicating directly with the keepers, not through individual shadows speaking to individual keepers, but through the network itself, broadcasting a message to all 7 active stations simultaneously. The message came through the containment protocols, appeared on monitoring displays, manifested as text formed from fluctuations in the power distribution systems. "You cannot win," the message read. "The containment will fail, the keepers will fall, the darkness will rise, but we offer you a choice again. As we have always offered choice. Join us willingly and become part of something greater, or resist and be consumed. When we break free, the outcome is inevitable, only the path differs." Marcus read the message and felt a chill run down his spine, because the shadows were right. The containment was failing, the equipment was too old, the keepers were too few, and eventually the barriers would collapse no matter what they did. But then he thought about Dr. Vance, about her 53 years of choosing to resist, about Sarah taking the burden despite knowing she might never be free, about David maintaining his vigil for 9 years in the darkness, about all the keepers across the network who had made the choice to stand against the shadows even when victory seemed impossible. And he realized that the shadows didn't understand humans at all. They thought the keepers served out of fear or obligation or lack of alternatives, but the truth was more complicated than that. The keepers served because they had chosen to, because they believed that buying the world, even one more day of freedom from the shadows, was worth any personal sacrifice, because they understood that some things mattered more than individual survival. Marcus sat down at a spare terminal in David's station and began composing a response using the same technique David had shown him, encoding a message into the containment protocols, broadcasting it through the shadow network to all the active keepers. His message was simple, direct, and defiant. "We know we cannot win forever," the message read. "We know the containment will eventually fail. We know the darkness will one day rise, but not today, not on our watch, not while we still draw breath. We are the keepers, the guardians, the line between shadow and light, And we will hold that line for as long as we can, not because we believe we can defeat you, but because every day we buy the world, every hour we hold you back, every moment we maintain the vigil is worth the price we pay. The message transmitted through the network reaching the other keepers at their stations, and Marcus felt their responses coming back not in words but in action: strengthened containment fields, renewed protocols, reinforced barriers. The 7 keepers across the network had received his message, and they were answering with their commitment to the vigil, with their refusal to surrender, with their determination to hold the line no matter the cost. David looked at Marcus with something like admiration in his eyes. "That was quite a speech," he said, "quite a rallying cry. You might have just given the network the boost it needed to hold together a little longer." Marcus shook his head. "I just told them what they already knew," he said, "what every keeper understands in their heart, that this isn't about winning or losing, it's about standing watch, it's about doing what needs to be done, even when the odds are impossible, even when the outcome seems predetermined, even when no one will ever know what you sacrificed." The shadows responded to Marcus's message, but not with words, with action. They began testing the barriers at all 7 active stations, simultaneously probing for weaknesses, coordinating their efforts in ways they never had before. The monitoring displays lit up with alerts: containment breaches at multiple locations, power fluctuations cascading through the network, temporal locks failing. David worked frantically at his station, rerouting power, reinforcing weak points, manually resetting protocols that had crashed, but it wasn't enough. The shadows were pushing harder than ever before, and the network was straining under the assault. Marcus joined him, working at the spare terminal, using the knowledge he had gained during his time as keeper at Station 17 to identify critical systems, to prioritize repairs, to keep the containment functional, even as parts of it began to fail. For hours they worked side by side, 2 keepers fighting against the darkness, buying the world time, 1 minute at a time, 1 system reset at a time, 1 emergency repair at a time. And slowly, gradually, the assault began to subside. The shadows pulled back, not in defeat, but in recognition that this coordinated attack hadn't broken the network, that the keepers had held the line, that more time would be needed before the final breakthrough. David slumped in his chair, exhausted. "We did it," he said. "We held them back. For now," Marcus said, "but they'll try again. They'll keep testing, keep pushing, keep wearing us down until the barriers finally fail." "So what do we do?" David asked. "How do we stop them permanently?" Marcus thought about the question, thought about everything he had learned about the network, about the keepers, about the shadows themselves, and slowly an idea began to form. "What if we don't stop them?" Marcus said. "What if we redirect them?" David looked at him, confused. "What do you mean, redirect them? Redirect them where?" Marcus pulled up the map showing all the facilities, both active and abandoned, and began sketching out his idea. "The shadows exist partially outside normal space," he said. "They can manifest in multiple locations. They can move between chambers, through the power grid, through the network itself. So what if we give them a path? What if we create a controlled breach at one of the abandoned stations and funnel all the shadows from all the facilities into a single location where we can contain them more effectively?" David stared at the map, his mind working through the implications. "You want to create a centralized containment facility," he said. "You want to concentrate all the shadows in one place." "Exactly," Marcus said. "Right now the network is stretched too thin, 7 keepers trying to maintain 7 separate facilities, but if we could consolidate the shadows, if we could redirect them to a single heavily reinforced location, then we'd only need 1 or 2 keepers to maintain the containment, and the rest could return to the surface, could warn people about what's coming, could prepare humanity for the day when the containment inevitably fails." "It's insane," David said. "It's impossible. It's our only option," Marcus finished, "because you said it yourself, the network is collapsing, keepers are dying or going insane or abandoning their posts, and when the next cascade begins, when the shadows coordinate another massive assault, we won't be able to hold them back, not with 7 stations, not with 7 exhausted keepers who have already given everything they have." David was quiet for a long moment, staring at the map, thinking through the logistics, the risks, the possibilities. "Which facility would we use?" he finally asked. "Which station has the infrastructure to contain shadows from all 7 active sites?" Marcus pointed to a marker on the map far to the north, in a remote area far from any population centers. "Station 1, he said, "the original facility, the first place where shadows were discovered, where the containment protocols were first developed. It's been abandoned for decades, but the infrastructure is still there. The chamber is 3 times larger than any other station, and the equipment was built to handle loads far beyond what we're currently dealing with." David pulled up records on Station 1, studying the specifications, the capabilities, the current status. "The containment fields are offline," he said. "The power systems are dormant. We'd need to restart everything from scratch, and we'd need to do it before we initiated the redirect, because if the shadows arrive before the containment is active, they'll escape immediately. So we send someone to restart Station 1, Marcus said, "someone who knows the protocols, who understand The system's someone who can get the containment operational before we begin the redirect. David looked at him. You're volunteering, aren't you? You're going to Station 1. Marcus nodded. I'm the only choice, he said. I'm not bound to a keeper station like you and the others. I can move between facilities. I can travel to Station 1 and do what needs to be done without abandoning a post, without creating another vulnerability in the network. David reached out and gripped Marcus's shoulder. This is suicide, he said. Even if you get Station 1 operational, even if you successfully redirect all the shadows, you'll be alone in a facility with concentrated darkness from 7 different chambers. There's no way you'll be able to maintain that containment by yourself. No way you'll survive more than a few weeks. Marcus smiled grimly. I know, he said, but those few weeks will give you and the other keepers time to evacuate, time to return to the surface, time to warn people, time to prepare for whatever comes next, and maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all any of us can do by the world. A little more time. David didn't argue anymore, didn't try to talk Marcus out of the plan, because he knew Marcus was right, knew this was their best option, knew that sometimes the only choice was between bad outcomes and worse ones. Instead, he began helping Marcus prepare, teaching him everything he knew about Station 1, about the systems there, about the protocols that would be needed to restart the containment, about the risks and challenges and impossible odds Marcus would face. They worked through the night, planning, coordinating, sending messages through the shadow network to the other keepers, explaining the plan, getting their agreement to participate in the redirect, preparing everyone for the moment when they would funnel all the shadows to a single location. And when morning came, when the first light began filtering down through the ventilation shafts, Marcus knew it was time to begin. He gathered his gear, said goodbye to David, and climbed the stairs back to the surface, back to the world of light, where people were waking up and going about their lives, completely unaware of what was happening beneath their feet, completely ignorant of the sacrifice that was about to be made on their behalf. Marcus climbed into his truck and started driving north toward Station 1, toward the abandoned facility that would become his prison, toward the role he had chosen, knowing it would be his last. The drive took 2 days through remote wilderness areas, where roads were barely maintained, where signs of human habitation grew increasingly sparse, where the landscape seemed to reflect the darkness Marcus was heading toward. He arrived at Station 1 just after dawn on the 3rd day. The facility was larger than Station 17 or Meridian Junction, a sprawling complex of buildings and towers that had been slowly reclaimed by nature over the decades of abandonment. Vines grew up the concrete walls, animals had made nests in the equipment rooms, and everywhere Marcus looked he saw signs of decay and neglect. But underneath the surface damage, he could see the bones of something extraordinary. This had been the prototype, the first attempt to contain the shadows, and even after decades of abandonment, it still had an aura of power, of purpose, of capability that the newer facilities lacked. Marcus entered the main building and made his way to the control room, where he found banks of equipment that hadn't been powered on in decades, circuit breakers that had been deliberately opened, monitoring systems that showed nothing but dark screens. He spent hours bringing the systems online, one by one, testing each component, verifying that the infrastructure was still functional, that the decades of disuse hadn't damaged anything critical. And slowly, gradually, the station came back to life. Lights flickered on in abandoned hallways, equipment hummed with restored power, monitoring displays showed readouts that indicated the containment systems were ready to be activated. Marcus descended into the chamber beneath Station 1 and found what he had been told to expect: a vast space far larger than the chambers at other facilities, with equipment that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie, massive field generators that could create barriers strong enough to contain shadows from multiple locations simultaneously. He activated the containment protocols, initialized the field generators, tested the systems to make sure everything was functioning correctly. And then he sent a message through the shadow network to David and the other keepers. Station 1 is operational, he transmitted. Begin the redirect. What happened next Marcus would remember for the rest of his short life as the most terrifying, beautiful, and awe-inspiring thing he had ever witnessed. The shadows from all 7 active facilities responded to the redirect simultaneously, flowing through the power grid, through the network, through the spaces between light and darkness, converging on Station 1 like rivers flowing toward the ocean. They came by the thousands, by the tens of thousands, more shadows than Marcus had imagined possible, more darkness than should have been able to exist in one place, and as they entered the chamber beneath Station 1, Marcus felt their collective consciousness, their hunger, their rage, their desire to be free. He activated the containment fields, trapping them inside, sealing the chamber, making Station 1 the prison it had been designed to be, and felt the binding protocol connecting him to the systems, anchoring him to this place, making him the keeper of concentrated darkness that had been gathered from across the network. The other keepers sent their final messages through the network. Thank you, Marcus, from David Chun at Meridian Junction. You've given us our freedom, you've given the world more time, you've given meaning to all the sacrifices that came before. We'll remember you from the keeper at Station 24, we'll tell your story, we'll make sure people know what you did. Hold the line from the keeper at Station 38, hold the line as long as you can. And then the network went quiet as the other keepers deactivated their stations and began the long climb back to the surface, back to lives they had almost forgotten, back to a world that didn't know how close it had come to being consumed by shadows. Marcus sat alone in the chamber beneath Station 1, surrounded by darkness that pressed against the containment fields, testing them, constantly searching for weaknesses, preparing for the moment when they would inevitably break through. He maintained his vigil, checking systems, resetting protocols, repairing equipment, doing everything he could to buy the world time to keep the shadows contained for as long as possible. Days passed, weeks. Marcus lost track of time in the unchanging darkness of the chamber. He ate the supplies that had been left for the original keepers decades ago. He slept in shifts on a cot he had brought from the surface, and he worked constantly maintaining containment that was straining under the pressure of concentrated shadows from 7 facilities. The shadows whispered to him, constantly offering him release, offering him connection, offering him the same things they had offered Dr. Vance and Sarah and all the keepers who had come before. But Marcus refused. He had made his choice, had accepted his role, had committed himself to holding the line for as long as he could. And when he could no longer hold, when the containment fields began to fail, when the equipment started breaking down faster than he could repair it, Marcus didn't panic, didn't despair, didn't give in. Instead, he activated the final protocol, the one that had been built into Station 1 from the beginning, the one that would ensure the shadows never escaped even if the keeper failed. He triggered the collapse sequence that would seal the chamber, permanently burying it under tons of concrete and earth, creating a tomb that would contain the shadows for centuries or millennia or forever. Marcus had 60 seconds to evacuate, 60 seconds to climb the stairs and escape before the facility came down around him. He used 58 of those seconds to make sure the containment fields would hold during the collapse, to verify that the shadows would be trapped, to confirm that his sacrifice would mean something. And then he ran. He raced up the stairs as the building began to shake, as support structures failed, as concrete cracked and steel groaned and everything began to fall. Marcus burst through the door into the morning sunlight and kept running as Station 1 collapsed behind him, as the ground opened up and swallowed the facility, as decades of infrastructure disappeared into a crater that marked the final resting place of shadows from across the network. He collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath, and looked back at the crater, at the dust rising from the rubble at the end of his vigil as keeper. It was done. The shadows were contained, permanently sealed beneath earth and concrete, with no way to escape, no way to influence the surface, no way to continue their slow, patient campaign to replace humanity. The network had been saved not by defeating the shadows, but by concentrating them and burying them in a prison that would last longer than any human institution. Marcus stood up slowly, his body aching from the sprint and the strain and the months of maintaining impossible vigils, and he looked up at the sky, at the clouds drifting past, at the sun shining down on a world that would never know how close it had come to being consumed by darkness. He walked to his truck, climbed in, and started driving south toward civilization, toward the life he had given up 3 years ago, toward whatever future awaited a man who had been a keeper twice, who had sacrificed everything twice, who had bought the world time twice. Days later, Marcus sat in a coffee shop in a small town, watching people go about their lives, and he thought about all the keepers who had come before him, Dr. Vance with her 53 years, Sarah Chun, who might still be sitting in the darkness beneath Station 17, David Chun, and the 5 others who had been freed by the consolidation and collapse, all of them standing watch at different times in different places, buying the world time that it would never acknowledge. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "We made it," the message read. "All 7 keepers returned to surface safe, recovering, adjusting to daylight again. Thank you, Marcus. Thank you for giving us our lives back, David." Marcus smiled and typed a reply. "Thank each other," he wrote. "You all held the line. You all maintained the vigil. You all made the choice to stand against the darkness. I just helped coordinate what you were already doing." Another message came through a few minutes later. "What will you do now?" the message asked. "Where will you go?" Marcus thought about the question, thought about his empty apartment, his job with Northern Power Solutions, his life that had been interrupted twice by encounters with shadows. "I don't know," he typed honestly, "but I think I need to find a new line of work. I think I've had enough of remote power stations and underground chambers to last a lifetime." The response came quickly, understandable. The message read, "But if you ever need anything, if the shadows ever return, if new facilities are discovered, you know how to reach us. We're all connected now, all part of the network. Even without the binding protocol, we'll always be keepers in our hearts." Marcus put his phone away and looked around the coffee shop at the mundane normalcy of life on the surface, and he felt profound gratitude that this was still possible, that people could still sit and drink coffee and talk about trivial things without knowing about the darkness that had almost consumed them. He finished his coffee, paid his bill, and walked outside into the afternoon sun, his shadow falling normally behind him. No delays, no independence, no signs of the transformation that had once threatened to replace him. Marcus looked down at his shadow one last time and whispered a quiet thank you to all the keepers who had stood watch, who had maintained vigils, who had sacrificed everything so that ordinary people could live ordinary lives in ordinary daylight without fear of the darkness beneath their feet. And then he walked on toward whatever future awaited him, knowing that his time as keeper was finally truly completely finished, knowing that the shadows were sealed, knowing that the world was safe for now, knowing that he had done everything he could and that it had been enough. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to The Real Conflict Zone for more mysterious and chilling tales that will keep you thinking long after they end. These are the stories that remind us that heroism often happens in darkness, that sacrifice often goes unrecognized, that the most important battles are fought by people whose names will never appear in history books, but whose choices make all the difference. Write down your suggestions in the comment box about what types of stories you want to hear next. Do you want more tales of hidden guardians maintaining impossible vigils? Do you want psychological horror that explores the thin line between sanity and madness? Do you want mysteries set in forgotten places where the rules of reality don't quite apply? Or do you want something completely different, something that will surprise you and challenge your expectations? We read every comment we listen to. Every suggestion. Looked up as Marcus approached, and he was struck by her eyes. They were sharp and clear despite her age, but haunted, filled with the weight of too many years spent in darkness. Another one, she said, her voice raspy from disuse. They send you to take my place, or did you just stumble down here on your own? Marcus stopped a few feet away from her, his flashlight illuminating the small space she had carved out for herself in the darkness. My shadow led me here, he said. I didn't know this place existed until tonight. I'm a technician with Northern Power Solutions. I came to investigate power fluctuations. The woman laughed, a dry, bitter sound. Power fluctuations, she repeated. Is that what they're calling it now? Back in my day, they were honest about it, called them containment breaches, shadow manifestations, evidence that the barriers were failing, but I suppose sanitized language makes it easier to pretend everything's normal. Who are you? Marcus asked. Dr. Eleanor Vance, the woman replied. I was a physicist brought in to study the anomalous energy readings coming from this location. That was in 1972. I was young, ambitious, thought I could explain everything with mathematics and theory, thought I could reduce the universe to equations and proofs. She gestured at the shadows pressing in around them, at the equipment she had spent decades maintaining, at the chamber stretching away into darkness. I was wrong, she said. Some things can't be explained, can't be contained with logic and reason. Some things exist outside the boundaries of what we consider possible, and once you've seen them, once you understand what they are, you can never go back to the comfortable certainty of ignorance. Marcus knelt down beside her chair, looking at the monitoring displays. The readouts were alarming: containment field strength at 16% and dropping, power distribution unstable, temporal locks failing. How long have you been down here? He asked. 53 years, Dr. Vance replied. 53 years of watching these screens, of maintaining these systems, of making sure the shadows stay contained, of preventing what would happen if they escaped. She looked at him with those haunted eyes. And I'm tired, Marcus Webb. I'm so very tired. I've given my entire adult life to this place. I've sacrificed everything, my career, my relationships, my chance at a normal life, and for what? To buy the world a few more decades before the inevitable happens, before the containment fails completely, before the shadows break free. Marcus felt a surge of desperation. There has to be a way to restore the containment, to strengthen the barriers. The shadow said, you know the protocols. Dr. Vance shook her head slowly. The protocols were designed for temporary containment, she said. They were never meant to last this long. The equipment is ancient, the power requirements are astronomical, and the shadows are so much stronger now than they were 50 years ago. They've learned, they've adapted, they've found ways to work around the barriers. So what are you saying? Marcus asked. That there's no hope, that we should just give up and let them win. Dr. Vance was quiet for a long moment, staring at her monitors, watching the readouts fluctuate. I'm saying that the containment cannot be restored, she finally said. Not with the current systems, not with the equipment we have, not without a complete rebuild of the entire facility, and that would require evacuating the area, shutting down the power grid, explaining to the authorities why we need to dig up a 60-year-old station and rebuild it from the ground up. She looked at him again. Do you have any idea how that conversation would go? She asked. Do you think anyone would believe us? Do you think they'd allocate the resources needed, even if they did believe us, or would they decide it's cheaper to just decommission the station, shut it down, and let nature take its course? Marcus realized she was right the moment they tried to explain what was really happening here. The moment they mentioned shadow entities and containment protocols and underground chambers that shouldn't exist, they would be dismissed as crazy, labeled as unreliable, and removed from their positions. The shadows had won not through force but through impossibility. They had created a situation where the only people who knew the truth were the ones who couldn't possibly convince anyone else of it. So what do we do? Marcus asked. Dr. Vance reached out and placed a weathered hand on his arm. We do what I've been doing for 53 years, she said. We maintain the systems for as long as we can. We buy the world as much time as possible. We accept that we cannot win, only delay the inevitable, and we make our peace with the sacrifice. Marcus pulled away from her, standing up and pacing in the small space. No, he said, there has to be another way. There has to be something we can do other than just sit here and wait for the end. Dr. Vance watched him pace with something like sympathy in her eyes. You're still thinking like someone who has a life to return to, she said, someone who has things waiting for them above ground, but that changed the moment you came down here, the moment you saw the shadows, the moment they marked you as one of theirs. She